For Lab 5, the axial skeleton, I'll be going over the skull. Start with the bones of the skull. The coronal bones include the frontal bone, about where the forehead is. The parietal bones, left and right parietal bones. The occipital bone down here, most posterior cranial bone. On the lateral sides, we have the temporal bones. We have a right and left temporal bone. We pop the skull up, open. We can see down here the sphenoid bones. This is all sphenoid bone, all of this. And then here is a part of the ethmoid bone, which also can be seen looking into the nasal cavity. So I'll flip the skull around. For the facial bones, we have the zygomatic bone here. We have the mandible down here. We have the maxilla bone here, maxilla bone. We have the nasal bones here and here, the lacrimal bone here. Deep down in here, some more sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone. Within the nasal cavity, we can see the vomer down here. There's the inferior nasal concha on either side, inferior nasal concha. Up there's all ethmoid bone. Now if we look at the bottom view of the skull, way down here, this is the palatine bone. Here is one palatine bone, here is the other palatine bone. Those are the bones of the skull. Next is the sutures. Just give me 1 second. So, between the frontal bone and the parietal bone is the coronal suture between frontal bone and parietal bone. Between the two parietal bones is the sagittal sutures. That's the sagittal suture. Between the parietal bone and the temporal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, we have the squamous sutures. This is the squamous suture. And between the parietal bones and the occipital bone, we have the lambdoid suture. So there's part of it there, and then it continues on top. And then, of course, we have some special features to various bones. The frontal bone has sinuses on the inside, which you can't see. The temporal bone has the zygomatic process, the mandibular fossa, the external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process, and the styloid process. The mandible has the mandibular condyle. Looking down inside the skull, we can see the sella turcica, the sphenoid bone. Of the ethmoid bone, we can see the point, which is the crista galli, and the tissue around it, which is the cribriform plate. Also for the ethmoid bone, the upper portion here is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And then, of course, for the occipital bone, looking a view below, these two rounded regions are the occipital condyles, and they're on either side of the foramen magnum. Up here for the maxillary bone, this region is the palatine process, so palatine process, palatine process. And that is it for the skull.